Well, hey guys, as you can probably tell, we're back in the office today instead of the home office. I'm gonna tell you how my day is going so far. Uh, it is day I don't know of the social distancing, and I have run out of the good hair stuff. So I'm using the cheap hair stuff, which means I certainly can't go without a hat. And then I couldn't find my good hat, so you all get the fishing hat with my initials on it. Jeffrey, and I love my middle name, so don't even mess with me, Lorenz Niehaus. There I am. Okay, so you get to look at this goofiness for the entire time. Here's another thing I want to start you out with. Let's do this and say, hey, guess what? Everybody took their exam 4, and it looks like things went really well. I got about an 86% average for the entire class when it came to taking the exam. I'm just going to treat that as a good sign that things are going fine, that people have what they need in order to get the information into their brain in such a way that they can get it back out of their brain when I give them a test. I really hope that that is the case. I really hope that this is working. And keep it up. You only have one more exam left to go. Keep in mind, today, Friday, is when your last quiz is going to open. Your Chapter 15 quiz has already been entered as full credit for everyone since we won't be covering Chapter 15. But Chapter 14 will be open on Friday and will close next week. All right. So that being said, what's going on in Chapter 14? Chapter 14 is social psych. Social psych is actually both one of the most interesting and most frustrating chapters to cover. Social psych is also one of the chapters that gets its very own class at the 300 level. Development gets a class at the 200 level. The chapter on neuroscience has an entire major behind it, which is why we're not even covering it. Industrial organizational psychology has its own class, and social definitely also has its own class along with personality. So this is kind of a smattering of little things that you would learn more in depth if you decided to take the next level of class. First thing we need to do then is figure out exactly what it is that the boundaries are around this topic that we call social psych. And it's distinct from sociology. Now, they're kind of related, they have overlapping definitions, and they sound a lot alike, but the social psychologist is still focused on the cognition, the information processing of a person in a social context. So the psychologist is interested in the mental and cognitive side of being in the presence of other people, how other people's presence or perceived presence affect us and affect our function, affect our behavior, and affect our cognition. So an example of something that a social psychologist might pursue is, does a person have a tendency to work faster when other people are watching? On which tasks? How many people? What kind of people? Those are social psych questions because they are about how an individual is perceiving and an individual is behaving. The sociologist, on the other side, will kind of study not people, but groups, which would mean that the sociologist is more interested in the kind of statistical regularity of what might happen to a percentage of people who are in a group. So if you're looking at policy, the sociologist might say, hey, if we have low inflation in the economy, how does that affect how people decide to attend college or not attend college? That's not about how people make decisions, but it's a reflection of, as a group, what proportion of people will make a certain decision if we change the rules or if we change society. So social psychology, that's what we're studying. Sociology, I'll leave it to the sociologists. One of the first things that it turns out then that needs to be defined and looked into when it comes to social psychology is this idea of the self, because since we're not looking at group behavior, since we're not looking at the group itself, but instead the individuals within that group, we've got to have some idea as to what is self, the cognitive contained unit within that group, and then what is outside of that self, which are the influences, the social influences that we're studying as social psychologists. Now, here's a fun little rant that I like to go on occasionally. This Seems like an easy question, and it is not. The book starts off the concept of the self by using the other concept, self-concept, to try to explore it. And in trying to figure out what a self is, and therefore what a self-concept is, you realize how quickly you run into a logical loop-de-loop, cul-de-sac, self-reference. The definition in the book of self-concept is this: the way one thinks about oneself. If you're not exactly clear about what a self is, this isn't going to clear it up for you, okay? Self-concept, if that is what you think about oneself, then essentially this is giving you the definition of self, that self equals self. So what is self? This is a little bit more philosophical, but I'm ready to go for it. Self is not easy, even though it feels easy. And the reason it's not easy is because despite our impression that somewhere in our brain is us sitting in the brain tissue or somehow separate from the brain or the body or physical mass, and that's the thing that we tend to think of is our self, there is no such thing. There is nothing more than the cumulative expression of a whole bunch of matter that is very complexly organized, incredibly sophisticated, but not holistic, not one thing, and not centralized into something that we could call a self. There is no brain within a brain that you can call you, and then the rest of it is your brain. You are your brain. So the problem with self then becomes that your brain is a bunch of different parts, each one of which is likely to have a different job, and which might not really be integrated in such a way that they're always sharing all information with each other all the time. There may be information in the brain that is used to process a certain bit of information, but then goes nowhere, so that other parts of the brain will never be aware that that information existed. So there is not one self within you. There are many, many, many encapsulated, isolated pockets of information processing, none of which really have a better claim to selfhood than any other part. So the question then becomes, if you are your brain, which parts of your brain are you? Some of them? All of them? Some subset of them, which you want to kind of pick and choose and say, this is me? That's a bigger question than we're going to have time to solve here, but I wanted to throw that out there as a thing that really makes the whole question difficult, okay? We're going to go skipping along in our exploration of self and social psychology without having resolved this central tension. But I do want to let you know that it's there, and I do want from here on out, anytime that you're in a class or in a discussion that relies on everybody kind of having a common understanding about what me or self or I actually means, I want you in the back of your mind, if not the front of your mind, to realize that the entire discussion is likely to be on shaky empirical ground because nobody has figured out what they're talking about in the first place. Example, self-esteem, the other self term that is in your book. How can we have a self-esteem if we don't in fact possess a single thing in us that is self? And the easy answer to that is like, well, we don't have one self-esteem. We have esteem for the different things that we do. You can have esteem for yourself as a student that is separate from your esteem as an athlete, that is separate from your esteem as a relationship partner, as a son or daughter, as a parent, as a sibling. Those are all kind of different selves that we can feel good or bad about us, about ourselves in each one of those different contexts, okay? So we'll have to leave it at that, but I want you to remember it's more complicated, as it almost always is. How is it then that we evaluate ourselves, whatever part of ourselves we're evaluating, whatever the heck self might mean, in order to come to some feeling about our position in the world, about how we are doing? And one thing that social psychologists have discovered quite clearly again and again is that our read on how happy we should be, how well we're doing, how much we have, whether we should be content, all that stuff is never an absolute evaluation of how much we have. What we do as human beings is engage in this thing called relative evaluation. We figure out a reference group to compare ourselves to, and then we figure out where we rank in that reference group. Okay? So, if you are referencing a group that is doing significantly, or at least statistically better than you are doing what's called an upward social comparison. If you look at your salary and you compare yourself to people who are making more, you're doing what's known as an upward social comparison. And the picture here is of a person, I'm particularly focused on this person right here, who in absolute terms has a very nice setup. That is a porch, it has a back room, it has a garage that looks like it can hold 2 or 3 cars. It is 2 stories, it looks nice. It looks painted, the lawn is cured. It's just it looks like it'd be a really nice place to live. But what we know about the social psychology of it all is that that person is unlikely to be particularly happy with their house, because the context of that house is a neighborhood full of houses that are significantly larger and nicer than that house. It's really unfortunate, because that house has the potential to make a person perfectly happy. But in the context of people who have more, it's easy for a person to get depressed that they have less. Now, upward social comparison is a two-edged sword. It can either be depressing because you haven't caught up and you're doing worse than everybody else, or for certain people under certain circumstances with certain attitudes and personalities, it can be motivating. Say, hey, that's what I'm shooting for. I want that. I'm going to engage in the behavior necessary to change my status to match the people that I'm currently comparing myself to. Another way to figure out how you're doing is downward social comparison. Downward social comparison has a tendency to feel good. Whatever you have, if you pick your reference group to be somebody or some group of people who have less than you, then you know what? Great. You get to have a shot of superiority coursing through your veins. And that can actually feel pretty good. It's not motivating necessarily, but it's nice. You think, okay, look at the world. Everybody who matters is not doing as well as I am. Great. That's a nice feeling. Okay. Why is it that, by the way, we might work this way? Now, some of you might be thinking, well, that's stupid. I'm not even sure I believe it. And even if we do work that way, that's a dumb way to be. In fact, if you tend to look at things from an evolutionary perspective like I do, this is the only thing that would actually make sense. Because natural selection, the process of natural selection, has never been about absolute reproductive success. It is always about relative reproductive success. If you think you've done well because you have 4 children, and you've replaced yourself on this earth 4 times, but statistically twice, because you mixed your DNA with another person, and each of those kids is half you, and so 4 halves is 2. You're like, hey, I've doubled me in the world. That's great. I'm a winner. But that's only true if the person next door hasn't done something like had 5 kids or 6. So the only winners in the game of natural selection are the ones who outcompete the people who are also reproducing. There is no gold standard of success that ensures that you're going to do well in the game. The only standard is how other people are doing and whether you are getting an advantage or not on them. Organisms that live nice, long, happy lives are not necessarily going to exist after a long time over natural selection if they're not reproducing as well as other people. So my point is that a human being who is designed to be content with any particular amount of success, however you define it, love, children, material success, shelter, safety, food, anybody who is designed to hit a certain point and be content with it is going to eventually lose the game to somebody who is never content and is always looking to make sure that they have more than they did yesterday or more than their neighbor has. Happiness, under this way of seeing it, is really not the goal of life, but a motivational system that is designed to get you to the goal. The goal is to have more than the next guy or more than you had yesterday. So if you were ever able to experience a permanent happiness that would reduce your motivation to do more, then there's a good chance that you would fall behind the person who was never satisfied. Now, does that make for a happy organism? Nope. That sucks. That's miserable. But you know what? I think maybe you will intuit a grain of truth to what I'm saying. It seems like for some reason we are not designed to be happy, right? Does anybody here feel like the basic nature of their design is to ensure happiness all the time? It almost seems to be the opposite. We have to work really hard for moments of happiness, and our baseline is often anxiety, worry, depression, need, want, all those things that in fact are making us do the next thing. As an aside, that's why I've put the cover here of Robert Wright's book, Why Buddhism is True. Robert Wright is an amateur. He's not a psychologist. He's not a PhD. He's an amateur writer who just happens to be one of those kind of bright people who has an eclectic interest and gathers interesting information and puts it in very readable form. Wright's books were things that I read early on when I started getting interested in evolutionary psych, and he was kind enough to answer an email or two when I was looking for a graduate program, recommended the school that I ended up going to. His book here, Why Buddhism is True, is not about why Buddhism is true, just to make sure you know that. There's nothing about the actual spiritual tradition or spiritual beliefs about what's going on in a non-physical realm that drives the content of this book. What this book is actually about is this understanding of happiness as a motivational system that tends to keep us miserable, and the sort of life hack methods by which the Buddhist tradition has short-circuited, circumvented, and defeated the natural order of the brain in order to achieve a larger state of happiness by no longer being in pursuit of the next or more or relatively more. So the kind of state of calm or meditation or enlightenment that comes with the practices that surround the spiritual tradition of Buddhism are the kind of things that we need to do for ourselves if we're going to get out of the natural functioning of the happiness unhappiness system. But in terms of social comparison, the story is very persistent. It's very clear. We compare ourselves to other people to figure out how happy we ought to be. And if we aren't doing as well as the next person, we feel like we're not going to be happy until we are. And even when we are, we're still never happy for the long term. There's always the next step. All right. After that comes the schemas. Schemas are a part of a lot of different areas of psychology, but in social psychology, a schema is a set of beliefs about a person or about somebody else that gives you expectations about what it is that you're going to see. It allows you to understand, interpret, and predict what's going to happen for yourself or for another person. Now, there are other schemas as well. Restaurant is a schema. You anticipate going into a restaurant, you anticipate someday going back into a restaurant, sitting down. You will be brought water or drinks and a menu by somebody who is taking your order. You don't worry about money until everything's done. Weirdly enough, you don't pay until the food is already actually in you. And that might be something that would be weird if you didn't know the schema, but you do know the schema. You know that the bill comes at the end, and you know that part of the schema is giving 15-20% tip to the server. And so that makes it all make sense. You know what's going to happen, and everybody else does. Schemas for people give you an expectation or a belief about how to interpret what's going on for that person, and what you can expect from them. A self schema might be a schema about your ability as a student. Here's one of the things that happens about schemas though. This person's schema might include a whole lot of feedback that says that their studenthood is good. They are a good student. They are an A student. If somebody's self schema is of an A student, When they encounter a B, things tend to get a little hairy. Now, there are two things that can happen. One is that they can have a bias that focuses them on only the worst kind of information, which sometimes happen. As a professor, if I have reviews and like 99 reviews are like really happy and glowing and thankful and appreciative, that doesn't matter because there's one review that says, this professor was disorganized and they sucked and I should have gotten a better grade and I hate them and I think that I'm going to drop this class and make sure that nobody ever takes them again and I'm going to drop the university and it's all his fault. That is the one that ends up defining who I am as a professor in my own head. But that's kind of an unusual situation. A lot of times when something happens that doesn't fit somebody's schema, people's memories will have a tendency to eliminate that as something that ever happened. So as odd as it may seem, non-conforming information to a schema will be ejected, in a sense, rejected from memory, from the brain, in a way that will make everything else fit together in the scheme in a nice, quick package. So either that person might forget that they ever got a B, or they will interpret that B in such a way that still provides consistency with their schema, which is this: it was an unfair grade. I'm an A student, but I got a B for somebody else's fault. I'm still an A student, I get A's, which is sometimes a disappointment for a student who gets one B. It's a real disappointment when they get two. It's a real disappointment when they get three. And they realize that the definition of an A student is a student who gets A's. And that can sometimes be a revelation for people that is a bit uncomfortable. But it's just an example of a schema. All right. Next, kind of jumping around. As I said, this is jumping from topic to topic to topic that you'll get a chance to go deeper into if you take social psych. There is the twin punches of impressions, first impressions, and self-fulfilling prophecies. These are two different concepts, but they interact in a way that I'm sure you'll find pretty clear. First impressions are something that human beings do really well. First impressions are something that human beings do really often. And even 100 milliseconds of exposure to a face, a picture of a face, or a person in real life will give somebody an impression about a whole bunch of characteristics about that person, which have a statistical relationship with the actual truth that is sometimes pretty impressive. Just having a brief flash about somebody's face and then guessing about how trustworthy they are, which would mean how they're about to act in an economics game that would involve trust between two stranger players. Somebody's reading of a face right away can help them to predict better than chance whether that person is going to be a free rider or a cheater in an upcoming economics game. Being able to tell the overall strength from a person by their face is actually something we're fairly good at. We're really good at. And then other abilities, leadership abilities, ability and competence in a task. It's weird that we can do this, but a first impression will have a relationship to how competent a person is going to be at a specific task. Now, the caveat I want to give to that is that this is nothing more than a statistical regularity. This is not an assured assessment that is always or even usually exactly right. Gathering more information about a person and being open to changing your mind about who they are and what they're going to do is a really important part of being a decent member of society who takes people as individuals and assesses their skills and their needs according to who they actually are. Because a lot of times first impressions are based on things that are in our society not relevant. And that's things like gender, things like race, that can give people an impression of somebody that turns out to really not reflect a proper evaluation of them at the individual level, but which might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's the other bit here. So if you put a schema down right away about a person that you're interacting with, and that schema then affects how you treat that person, and that person responds to how you treat them in such a way as to match the prediction that you'd made with your schema, then it was your prediction that caused the outcome in the first place. That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the classic examples, by the way, of self-fulfilling prophecy was a study that has since suffered a replication crisis, which was they gave teachers a list of students who were bright at math or who were dull at math, and then they tracked them over the course of a semester to see which students did better. Unbeknownst to the teacher, there was no basis whatsoever for the brightness and dullness. It was just randomly assigned. But by the end of the semester, the students that the teacher had been told were bright got better scores than the students that the teacher had been told were dull. That was a really famous finding for a long time, but people have since not really been able to replicate it, so it's not a great example anymore, but people might still give it, and I think it's even kind of mentioned offhand in your book as a possibility, even though they don't really talk about it anymore as a definite finding. Those first impressions and those self-fulfilling prophecies can also interact with what we'll talk about later as stereotypes. If you look down here at the XKCD, there's a big difference between evaluating a person according to their own skills and evaluating a person's skills and attributing it to a group to which they belong. One of them can be fair. The other one is the beginning of a prejudice. Speaking of first impressions and people who give a first impression about how competent they are, which might need to be revised later on, I have brought to you today's comedy break, which is the banger hit of the summer from 2016, the bad lip reading from The Empire Strikes Back. This is Yoda and Luke and R2-D2 in Seagulls, Stop It Now.
Penny for your thoughts.
I hate Brenda, and a bad guy hit me in the shin, and I peed all on my pants.
It's nothing a little music can't help. Rockin', rockin' and rollin'. Down to the beach I'm strolling. But the seagulls poke at my head, not fun. I said, seagulls, stop it now. To stroll on that beach. Said seagulls gonna come, poke me in the coconut, and they did, and they did, had me going like, nothing I could do but yell when these birds attacked me. When I tried to run, I fell, and then these kids started laughing, and then got hit in the neck with a hacky sack. Where'd it come from? Now run, 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 jump. I can be a backpack while you run, 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 jump, and stop. Put me down. I love to groove and boogie. Yeah.
Great.
Show you some dance moves.
No, I don't want you to.
If I had your giant feet out there on the beach, could have outrun those birds.
You're a psycho wiener.
Let me grab my beater.
Stop it, please. Don't hit me. Please. Don't hit me.
Come on, man, quit that banging.
Hey, what's that stank?
You put a fish in our basket.
Oh, yeah. I forgot I did that.
You owe me an apology.
Just hold your breath and see when the time is right. Birds will back your face. Now run, 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 jump. I can be a backpack while you run. Swing from a hairy vine. I can be a backpack while you climb. Stand on one hand and lift rocks with your special gift. Run, 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 jump. Now breathe. That's good. Like that. Like that. One day I was walking and I found this big log. Then I rolled the log over. Underneath was a tiny little stick. And I was like, that log had a child. Listen, boy, someday when you are older, you could get hit by a boulder. While you're lying there screaming, come help me, please. The seagulls poke your knees. it now.
Yeah, whatever. You're sort of pitchy.
Didn't like it?
Listen, man, I'm not your friend.
Don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep.
I hope that you enjoyed that as much as I and my children have enjoyed it. My daughter Maria has only developed any kind of interest in Star Wars so that she can watch that scene with Luke and Yoda in the swamp. I guess any way in is a good way in. All right, to wrap up today, then, we're going to talk about a couple more things, and the first of which is attributions. How do we interpret, make sense of, and then give ourselves information to predict the behavior and the outcomes for ourselves and for other people? That's attributions. Okay, to what do we attribute behavior or outcomes? And one of the things that social psychologists discovered right away when they were studying attributions is that there is this thing called a fundamental attribution error. The reason it's called fundamental is that it has a tendency to happen all the time. People will fundamentally over-ascribe a behavior to the person who is making the behavior. They will under-ascribe the behavior of a person to the circumstances in which that person finds themselves. So let's say you have somebody speeding down the highway, they pass you on the right, you're like, that person is a jerk. That person is a speeder. They are a jerk in every aspect of their life. I'll bet everybody hates them, and I wish that they would get in a wreck and die because they're worthless as a human being. That is a fundamental attribution error. You don't know what is going on for that person. They could be a reckless driver, but otherwise a very pleasant person. They could be in a situation where it is a life or death race to somewhere down the road, and while they're usually a relatively careful driver, they've turned it up now because there's a special circumstance. You don't know. But we have a tendency to say it's all about people. Even for ourselves, we have a tendency to say what has happened to us or what we have done is by virtue of the kind of person that we are, and we underestimate how much that is a product of the situation in which we have found ourselves. Now, within the fundamental attribution error, there nevertheless exists a difference between how we tend to interpret our behavior and how we tend to interpret the behavior of others. Fundamentally, we have a tendency to overascribe behavior to people, but within that fundamental misattribution, we do have a tendency to give ourselves more of a break than we give other people. So my behavior, especially if it's bad, will be situational. I'm not a reckless person. I'm not a speeder. I'm not a person who always looks at their phone while they're driving. It was a special circumstance. It's not about me. But if you look across at somebody in another car and they're on their phone, they say, that's a careless person who doesn't care about anybody else, and they're on the phone all the time. So we attribute other people's behavior to them as people, their disposition. We attribute our behavior to our situation, and that is called the actor-observer effect. There is a different interpretation for you as the actor than there is for you as the observer of somebody else's behavior. Now, a third level in the hierarchy of how we have a tendency to misattribute or make attributions is this. If you are now talking about only attributions within yourself, there is a tendency that good things that happen to you are by virtue of who you are as a person, but bad things that happen to you are because the world is set against you. All right? I see this among both unsuccessful and successful people. There are people who do not understand the advantages they've had by the luck of their birth when they succeed. All right? These are the people who say, nobody ever gave me anything. I did it all by myself. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, whatever that might mean, and they did everything they did for themselves, and they never got a head start. They never got an advantage on anybody, while forgetting that they were from an upper middle class family, never had to support their family when they were teenagers, got good nutrition, got good education. They were in good school systems. Their parents were ready to send them off to college. Their parents paid for their college, which was just normal, right? Nope. Those were all advantages that allowed whatever brilliance they had to shine through. But nevertheless, when they succeed, they will say, it was all me. Right? On the flip side, there's a tendency for people to say when something bad happens, it was because the world was set up in such a way, and they don't have any responsibility at all for something bad happening to them. A lack of planning, a lack of saving. If that was something that it was possible for you to do, but you didn't do it, and then you run out of money, well, that's something that you might have been able to take care of yourself. But nevertheless, people will say, hey, everybody's out to get me. This is called the self-serving attribution. When you are observing your own behavior and you attribute good things to yourself, but bad things to the world, that is called the self-serving attribution. All right. All of these things are true at different levels of comparison. The fundamental attribution error is that we have a tendency to attribute things to people when we should be attributing to situations. The actor-observer effect is that we tend to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt by saying it was the situation, but other people do things because of who they are. And then within our own behavior, good things are our fault, bad things are the world's fault. This self-serving bias will lead to people overrating themselves on rankings of goodness compared to other people. People will then have a tendency to say, I am more handsome than the average person. I am more moral than the average person. I'm a better driver than the average person. I am all sorts of things. I'm more intelligent than the average person. Well, that self-serving bias is in fact a bias, and it is not necessarily the truth. But human beings will have a tendency to carry a unrealistically positive vision of themselves relative to other people through the world. It doesn't hurt them necessarily that they're inaccurate. An inaccurate assessment of yourself can be a way to actually convince people that you're better than they are. So I'm not saying it's not functional. I'm just saying, on the whole, people tend to be a shade inaccurate in the self-serving direction. All right. Lastly, we've got attitudes. What is an attitude? An attitude is, again, a hard concept to really get around. It's like you know it when you see it, but when you try to study it empirically, it becomes a bit of a hassle. But people who study attitudes have identified 3 different things they can measure in order to get at this concept that they think is attitude. The first is affective. How do you feel about a certain thing? Okay, what is your attitude towards oranges? Okay, when I talk about oranges, when you think about eating one, how is it that you feel? How is it that you react? The next is intended behavior. Your book just says behavior. I'm making a little bit of a finer distinction here. I'm saying intended behavior. If you're like, I'm going to eat an orange tomorrow, that is your attitude towards oranges. There's more of a disconnect between attitude and behavior than a lot of people give credit for. All right, you can give a impression that you're going to do something, you can have an intention to do something, and you can have a very loudly signaled intention to do something. Oh, tomorrow I'm going to give $50 to a food bank. Well, that's great, and you might get all the social cred for being a food bank donor from declaring that intention, but when it comes time to actually do it, maybe you get busy. Maybe you're out of money, but you'll do it next week, maybe, and then you forget, and then you forget. So there's a kind of a disconnect between what you actually do and what your attitude towards something is, but a lot of times they're also correlated, so I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. The other thing is the cognition or thoughts that you have about that thing, that internal set of information or data or rumination that you have about some topic. That is your cognitive component of an attitude. Now, the idea that attitude and behavior are not linked is true, but interestingly enough, there is a reverse causal direction that a lot of people don't really appreciate when it comes to the connection that does exist between attitude and behavior. A lot of people will get the impression that somebody forms an attitude, that attitude lets them form their intentions, and their intentions then lead to behavior. But it turns out that we are wired in such a way that we form our attitudes by kind of looking through the back catalog of our behavior and reasoning or reconstructing what our attitude must have been since we have engaged in this behavior, right? So the upshot here is that we end up thinking as we do as opposed to doing what we think. And this leads to this phenomena called the foot in the door phenomenon. A great example of which is this. If somebody from a political campaign knocks on your door and asks you if it would be okay if they put a yard sign in your yard, you don't have to pay for it, you don't have to do anything, they're just going to stick it there. If you say yes and you let them put a yard sign in your yard, you might think that a human being might say, well, that's the last thing I do for that campaign. I've done my part. I let them put a yard sign on. Great, I made my contribution. I'm tapped. I'm done. I'm not going to do anything more for them. But the reality is that if you have a bunch of people who were asked to put yard signs and a bunch of people who were never asked to put yard signs, when you go back the next week and ask those people for donations or contributions, the people who agreed to put out a yard sign are more likely to give donations than the people who hadn't already been asked for a favor. And the idea there is that they're looking back on their own behavior and say, oh man, I must support Bob James. I put a yard sign for Bob James in my yard. I must be a Bob James supporter. And so my attitude towards Bob James is positive. I'm going to go ahead and give him money. That is how the attitude researcher interprets this thing called the foot in the door phenomenon. If you get somebody making little behaviors in line with a certain attitude, their later behaviors will be easier to get going because they already have a record of doing little things that are in line with a positive attitude towards your thing, right? When it comes to persuasion, this is another thing that has to do with attitude. Okay, if you want to change somebody's attitude, if you want to change their intended behavior, their cognition, their emotion, then you will have to engage in what's known as persuasion. Petty and Cacioppo had a model called the elaboration likelihood model, and it's still popular and it's still mentioned in your book. The elaboration likelihood model gives what are known as two different routes to persuasion. The first one is known as the central route. The central route basically says that a good argument is a good way to persuade people. And so if you were taking on an anti-vaxxer, I don't recommend it, but if you were going to take on an anti-vaxxer on social media and argue about vaccinations, central route persuasion might look something like this. You give them a chart of the incidences of MMR vaccines containing the preservative that was so touted by the anti-vax community as being the cause for autism. And you show them how that use of that preservative has dropped off over time to the point where nobody was using it as of the mid-90s. Then you show them all of the incidences of autism and how they have gone up over time regardless of what was going on with the vaccination. Now, that would be a central root message that please, people, stop saying that there was anything about this vaccine that was even correlated with autism rates, much less causal. Would you stop? That seems like for the arguer, it would be really, really persuasive. Unfortunately, since we're dealing with human beings, logic is not our strong suit. And central root persuasion is not something that has a tendency to make a big effect. And it certainly isn't something that has a tendency to make a big and immediate effect. Central persuasion, though, if somebody can spend enough time with it, soak in it, and remember it, will, if it has an effect, have a tendency to last longer. But really, if you're about changing somebody's mind quickly, even if temporarily, your best bet is what's known as the peripheral route. That is the emotional appeal. Not the message itself, but the cues surrounding the message are what carry the persuasion. So on the other side of this debate was Jenny McCarthy. Jenny McCarthy was a prominent anti-vax voice stating that her son had suffered from autism and that she had done X, Y, and Z, and through those mechanisms had healed or cured the symptoms of autism in her son. This person is physically attractive, famous, and therefore people were attending to this message in a way that they might not have if some frumpy scientist person had given them data. She got Jim Carrey kind of on board, got some other famous people, RFK Jr. on board, talking about this topic in such a way that kind of met people's emotion. The other thing that hits people's emotions when it comes to vaccination, not data, but a cue that is emotional or associated with the message, is the idea that vaccinations usually involve taking a sharp object and sticking it through your skin. That is something that people do not typically associate with a healthy outcome. If it's a knife, it's not going to be a healthy outcome if you stick it in your skin. If it's a fork, if it's anything else, usually puncturing the body envelope through the skin is not a good idea. And so, with that kind of presupposed assumption there, getting somebody to have a strong emotional reaction to something being stuck in the body is not that hard. I have, by the way, as a parent of a child with autism and a person who likes to think that he has a somewhat solid background, have lost more friends on Facebook because they refuse to give up anti-vax arguments than for any other reason. Sometimes you just got to cut bait and say, I don't have time for this, because sometimes no route to persuasion is going to be effective. And the best you can do is leave your central root arguments out there. Hope that someday they percolate through consciousness to have an effect, but in the meantime, save yourself the trouble and go do something else. Okay? That's it for today. I hope that was enjoyable. We've got 3 more lectures on social coming up. It's guaranteed to have videos and fun things that involve people hurting other people. It's going to be great. So we'll see you back on Monday for the 2nd installment. Have a great weekend. And man, it's our second to last week. We'll be finished up with all this stuff in no more than 2 weeks. See you later.